everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Attendance Bias, or actually, more specifically, the second part of a three-part miniseries called Flocking Outside, a miniseries about Goose from three Phish lifers. I'm no expert on Goose, so I enlisted two great fans and fellow podcast hosts from the Helping Friendly podcast to help me out, Brian Brinkman and Megan Gliona. This miniseries is meant to be something of a starter kit for anyone out there who wants to learn about Goose or is a big-time fan of other bands but is kind of Goose curious. So episode 1 covered the basic outlines of who and what Goose is all about, and this episode dives a bit more into their music, specifically covering the band's major rise in exposure and popularity from Goose Myst 2020 to their Radio City Music Hall gigs in the summer of 2022. So if you're down to continue this Goose journey, please join myself, Megan, and Brian for part 2 of Flocking Outside. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of Flocking Outside. I am here with Brian Brinkman and Megan Gliona, my two experts and Sherpas and guiding me through Goose. And Megan, how are you?
I'm excellent. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing all right. Mr. Brinkman, yourself?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much. Excited to be back.
I'm excited to have you back because episode 1 gave me a lot to chew on, a lot to think about. For those of you who did not get to episode 1, a 30-second recap. The overall view is I just kind of want to know more about Goose. I want to know about this new sensation that's sweeping the nation. And so Brian and Megan are kind of my guides, as I said earlier, to kind of give me the context, the background, and then along the way, to pick out some choice jams and some choice music that I should listen to match the information with the product. So now, welcome back. We are here to dissect the music mostly. Episode 1 was more about background info. Now we're getting to the jams, what everyone likes.
We're getting into it. It's pretty awesome.
Well, some people think so. Others, as we know, may not. I can't wait to tell you what I thought of it too. I really can't. I have a lot to say about it.
I'm so curious.
Yeah.
I'm so curious. What were your kind of general impressions of after listening to the playlist, which I hope people have had a chance to listen to since we put it out?
Yeah, it's in the the episode notes. So if you haven't checked it out, please do. Generally provided by my co-hosts. So overall, I think I like their songs more than I like their jams. A lot of people who I speak to who love Goose, well, the first thing they say why they love Goose so much, as the two of you do, is they're good songwriters, and they also always compliment the vocals. And I agree with both of those points. I think Rick, right, is the main lead singer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think he has a very listenable voice. I think it's very soothing. And I like listening to his songs. Is he the principal songwriter also?
Yeah, he writes alongside of a close friend of his, similar to the Trey Tom combination for Phish fans out there. Peter, the keyboardist and guitarist as well, contributes a number of songs as well. They're the two primary songwriters for the band, though.
Well, they have oodles of talent. I really enjoy their songs. When I checked out their website, I see that they describe themselves, right? They're self-described as, quote, American indie groove. And a friend of mine said on Twitter, I want more indie and less groove. And that kind of spoke to me. Because I could see, I've noticed on Sirius Radio that they're not limited, as a lot of other bands who I compared them to last episode maybe, they're not limited to jam on. They're kind of all over the place. And which is a good thing for them, of course, that exposure, because I think they can fit many genres. But I also, on the jam side of it, this is where my criticism comes in, and I'd like to hear more about your perspectives on them. Many of their jams, like once the song portion is over of each part, their jams feel, to me, kind of disconnected from the songs in which they're included. In a weird way, it's like everything is type 2. Because you could drag and drop almost any jam into any other song of the playlist that you gave me. That's not entirely true. I don't want to speak, in generalities, but that was my first big impression. And so to me, it begged the question, why do they have to jam for 20 or 30 minutes for every song? Why can't they be satisfied with a wonderful 5-minute and 17-second song? So I've softened quite a bit. I really was skeptical about them. But since the music didn't change from my first listen, I realized I've changed a little bit because I think differently and I like it. I really want to like their jams. To me, though, I think they're stretched a bit too far or a bit too long, and I don't see a lot of connection between the song proper and the jam. Those are my first big impressions overall.
Super interesting. I actually had a harder time getting into their jams at first, too. I even remember texting with you about it, Brian, at some point. I don't remember when it was, maybe last year or something, that I was having a harder time like accessing their jams, like understanding them.
Mm.
I feel a lot differently now. I think once I've listened to more of them and understand more of kind of who they are as musicians and how they're approaching these jams, I feel completely different about it. So I'm curious to see, Brian, if those feelings will change for you, because for me, I felt the exact same way when I first started listening to Goose.
Was there a certain click that you realized, like a certain song that did it for you, or did it just gradually happen, like your hair growing? Like one day you realize, you see a picture of yourself 6 months later and realize, wow, my hair is a lot longer than it was 6 months ago.
I think Brian just sent me enough jams that were incredible that I
So overwhelmed
eventually,
you.
he overwhelmed me, and I just eventually could not avoid my love for it. No, but especially listening back to this playlist, holy shit. I mean, this playlist is just, I think, a perfect example of the variety in their jams and what they do best. It's interesting that you say that, because I feel like people might say your criticism about their jams about Phish, that you would listen to Carini and you end up in a Bliss jam, right? Or you listen to Simple and you end up in a Monster Evil jam. So to me, that doesn't bother me. I hear like so many of their jams really stretching out and layering on top of each other and really going for melody as opposed to kind of dissonance in a way that I think is pretty magical.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we're going to talk about it here when we get into kind of how this band has continued to evolve, because we're at a point where, coming out of 2020, I thought Goose was a really fun curiosity. It was a fun band that I was listening to more than I expected to. The bingo tour, as I talked about in the last episode, the fall drive-in shows, in some cases those were kind of comfort food during the pandemic, and there was a question in my mind of, okay, when Phish comes back, when more live music comes back, when artists start releasing those records that they've been holding out because of the pandemic, am I really going to be going back to this band? And as we get into the spring and summer 2021 tour, you hear a very noted step forward in terms of their jamming. That said, to your 2 points, I agree with one, I disagree with the other. And the one I agree with is the length factor. And I think that that's something that for a lot of people like myself, with our relationship with Goose right now, there's a lot of debate about, is the length necessary sometimes? A lot of times you'll hear a jam from them that doesn't necessarily need the full time that they play it. But the part of the reason why I think that they're playing it for as long as they're playing it is this almost kind of hypnotic nature, this kind of raga type of element. Rick has talked extensively about his influences on Eastern mysticism, raga type beats, raga type melodies. And I think that there's an element to their music that is, you get into a riff, you get into a rhythm, you get into this hyper connected moment within the band. Part of the challenge and part of the joy of that comes with, can we just play that repeatedly over and over and over again? And can we get our listeners and our fans into kind of like a hypnotic groove? And there was a great example of it, jumping way, way ahead, but there's a version of Wisteria Lane from Goose this past year in just outside of Denver that goes on for 7 or 8 minutes of the exact same melody based around Peter's keyboards. And the biggest impact that it seems to have on the band is Peter's keyboards became a huge, huge vehicle for exploration come the spring tour of 2023. So I think in a sense that they are utilizing jamming as a way to stretch out ideas, see what works over really long periods in time that require a lot of patience. But that said, there are other elements, there are other examples of more efficient jamming. And you start to hear that in the early parts of 2022, where the band was able to say, let's chop off the 6 minutes of the same thing over and over again, and let's try to condense that in an intense manner, in a 3 or 4 minute period in time. But they keep going back and forth with it. I think the length aspect is both kind of a jam band crutch in a lot of cases, and I think that's, there are certain Phish jams I'll listen back to and be like, that could have probably been 10 minutes shorter. And also hey, we stumbled into this groove. Let's just see what happens with it. Let's live in this zone. And in a lot of cases, they'll go back to those little areas and they'll pluck out a riff, and that will become a song in the future. So I do agree with you, although I see kind of the rationale for it. Where I disagree is I think the type 2 thing is kind of like Meg said, you get that in even Phish jams where like they're playing rock and roll in a specific key, and then Trey hits a minor key and boom, they're off and they're gone. And that jam, you could have listened to just that jam without the song portion and got the same amount out of it had it been 5 or 6 other songs. I guess I would also say like one thing that like Goose does really well is incorporate their melody from their song as they're working out into a type 2 area, which oftentimes leads to a slightly different criticism that fans have for them. And like a song like Animal is a perfect example of this, that they will stretch what could be a 4-minute rock song into a 12-minute rock song that doesn't need to be 12 minutes because they're kind of seeing where they can go with it. And so as a result of it, where you could have had 2 or 3 songs within a set list, you get just one song, takes up a bunch of real estate, looks pretty cool on paper, but you listen back to it, it's basically a 5-minute song that's stretched out.
I was just going to say one thing that they also do really well is Rick is always able to bring it back to the song. There is like never a ripcord, never. It's so smooth always in a way that just stands out when I listen to his jams. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Brian.
Yeah, and believe it or not, I thought a lot about what you said, Megan, earlier with that people can describe Phish in the same terms. And Brian, you brought it up too. The way I felt, and it's really difficult for me to verbalize, is with a type 2 Phish jam, like you mentioned, I think Carini, for example, Megan, that or Simple, like you said, that to me, there's more of a journey for my ears, like where it comes, and the band seems so much more patient before they end up at that bliss jam or that dark space. But to Brian's point, I think that Goose's jams, at least the ones I've heard, require more patience on the part of the listener because the band doesn't seem as patient. They seem very alert. They seem to know exactly where they're going to go, at least to my ears. And I'm not as experienced listeners as the two of you, but that's the impression that I got. And so for me, I kind of like taking the journey with Phish, and with Goose. To me, it seems like, oh, I'm a little behind. Like I have to kind of catch up with, because they're already 8 bars into where they're going to be. I wasn't on that journey with them, but there were several times where I said, is this rehearsed or is this spontaneous? And it ended in a question mark, and I don't know. But I want to leave myself off there because I don't want to steal too much from the future of our breakdown of the playlist. So both of you, the two of you, kind of put together this killer playlist. So I'm curious, Megan, what is on this playlist for our benefit of our listeners, and why were some of the jams chosen?
Well, the way this all went down is I talked to Brian and shared kind of the things that I was interested in making sure that you heard and that you learned about. And some of those included like songwriting, the talent of the band, danceability, their influences from indie rock and like that kind of Peter Gabriel 80s vibe. And then, Brian did his magic and created this incredible Goose playlist. So Brian, tell us why you picked these jams.
We decided we wanted to present Brian with a Live One-esque compilation, which gave us a couple of restrictions. One, can we try to fit this onto 2 CDs? Which no, we failed because we gave him a couple of 30-minute, 40-minute songs. But 2, can we keep this in a specific time period for Goose, similar to how a Live One showcases Phish's development through 1994? And can we have this flow in the way that, someone would want on an album? So we went with a few selections. I'm going to warn all of you Goose heads out there. There are a lot that have been left off. I'm aware of this. The initial list was like 35, 40 jams long.
If you know Brian Brinkman, it was super long.
was
You
He
very
does
know
it for
long.
the
It was very
people. He
detailed.
does it because he loves it.
Yeah, exactly. If you have issues, you can text me. Okay, I'm not. You're not. Don't DM me. So we went with the 8/22/21 tumble from the Fred Festival, the 12/17/22 Time to Flee from Goose, the 11/17/21 Into the Myst, the studio cuts of Born into Hungersite into Dripfield off of Dripfield, the 2/7/22 This Old Sea, the 6/15/21 Western Sun into Echo of a Rose, the 3/10/22 Rockdale, and the January 29th 22 Empress of Organos, and tried to give, what would a set of Goose maximalized be? And this is a very long set of Goose, but I think ultimately, as I thought this through, and I think this is a good segue into kind of our discussion for today, the onset of the spring 2021 tour was an opportunity for Goose to test themselves once again. They had really passed this test from a marketing standpoint, from a musical standpoint throughout 2020 in a way that nobody was asking for and nobody anticipated. And then suddenly we're going into 2021 and there's all this hype for it. And every single person in the country wants to go see a concert again. And Goose is on tour and they're still playing some drive-in shows throughout the spring of 2021. But what happens specifically the April 9th, All I Need, the May 8th, Rosewood Heart, and Jive 2, and then moving into summer, the June 11th Arcadia and the June 15th Western Sun and Echo of a Rose, is for someone like myself, you start to hear Goose taking risks in jamming that they hadn't taken before. And rather than focusing their entire jam around a build up to a rock peak, what they were searching for were these kind of moments within a jam where Rick, Peter, and specifically Ben, their drummer, could kind of connect around these kind of hypnotic grooves that I keep mentioning, where they'd find a riff, they would repeat that riff over and over and over again. They'd introduce effects into that riff and they would distort it in ways that made it more danceable, made it more listenable, and really showcased their ears and their listening, their skills at listening to each other. And what you ultimately get out of these jams is not yet, and this is kind of a later point to discuss, but not yet the deep, dark, abstract explorations that you were getting out of Phish in 1993 through 95, but you're getting more of what would Phish have sounded like if in 1992 they were still jamming the way that they were in the late 80s, or the way that they would a couple of years later, where it's a little bit more focused around the song that it emerged from, but it's more focused around singular riffs and singular ideas, the yes and nature, without completely diving off the cliff and seeing what's on the other side.
I had the thought while listening to a lot of these songs is, you just mentioned Phish in the early to mid 90s. On the podcast, on the Tendon Spies podcast, I had their PR agent, Sue Drew. She's the Elektra executive who signed Phish to Elektra Records. And she told anecdotes about how they could very easily write a pop hit rock song that's digestible for a lot of people and just keep doing their live thing. She said they just kind of weren't interested, like they had no appetite for any sort of fame or more commercial conventional success. To me, Goose sounds like a very categorical jam band who wouldn't say no to that sort of success in terms of their songwriting
Totally.
craft. I think they are much more digestible. They're a lot more accessible. I like listening to them. I wouldn't be embarrassed to show some friends some Goose songs, as opposed to like say, hey, check out this version of Stash, and someone like laughing it off.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we're going to talk about that when we talk about Dripfield, but that album is definitely a move towards that.
Yeah.
Move towards making something that's not an album that demonstrates what they can do live.
I was just going to say that's something that has always been appealing to me about them, is there has always kind of been this attitude in the larger jam band world of like, let's shun pop culture and let's be weirder than that. And we have our own crew. And in some cases, that's really cool. Like there's something really fun about knowing a band like really, really well that you step one foot into pop culture and people have no idea what you're referring to. There's an ownership aspect to that I think people really like. I think the thing that is interesting about Goose is there feels like it hasn't yet happened. So we're not necessarily in that territory yet, but there feels like there's an opportunity where the outside world could be pulled in and at least understand this is why so many of us love this music. That you could listen to a song like Born or like Hungersite and not really go much deeper, but maybe go to a Goose concert at some point and at least walk away being, and I've experienced this, I'm sure you guys have as well, where I bring someone to a Phish show who has no expectations. They don't listen to the shows. They don't think about this. They're just going to a concert and they walk out going, that was the best concert I've ever seen. I don't know how, like, the realization of like, there are so many people in that room that care about that thing and that actually impacts this rather than just we're going to a concert tonight and I just kind of like this band. And so I think that there is an element for Goose to bring the outside world into it, which is really exciting.
Yeah, in a weird way, I kind of respect them for that. In a way that they're a product of their time, in the same way that Phish was a product of theirs. Like you said, Brian, there is a long-standing, maybe tradition question mark of in the jam band scene of let's eschew the mainstream and do our own thing. All these different, even the word jam band is outdated, I think, at this point. All these different genres and styles with the amount of information and music that's so easily accessible, genres are kind of gone and anyone can listen to anything at any point at the tap of a button. So I kind of respect them in a way, which is, my 15-year-old self would be very disgusted with me now, but I kind of respect them for, I don't think they're actively necessarily chasing that sort of mainstream success, but they're also not avoiding it the way that some of our other favorite, more traditional jam bands are.
Right, exactly. I agree completely.
Let's dive into this playlist. So, Brian, what's first for us?
So, looking at this from a chronological standpoint, and I think this episode we're going to kind of cover spring 2021 through the Trey sit-in at Radio City as kind of like their next breaking point. But spring summer tour 2021 was the first time I saw Goose. I saw them close out their summer tour proper. They would play a few additional dates after this, but I saw them close out here in Denver. Fun fact, they sold out Sculpture Park, which is right across the street from where I'm sitting right now, with about 3,500 tickets, and then opened it up and said at the end of that show that it was the biggest concert that they'd played to date, and then opened up another 1,500 tickets for the next show, sold it out immediately. So there was a very clear understanding. You walked away from that weekend knowing that the next time that they'd already booked the Mission Ballroom for that November, but you knew that the next time they played a summer show in Denver, they were playing Red Rocks. And there was this just heightened anticipation about them playing here in Colorado and what this would mean ultimately for them. But leading up to that, as I noted, there were a bunch of drive-in shows. Everything for me leads up to June 15th. I still think it's one of the 5 best Goose shows I've ever listened to. It's from Perry, New York. Beautiful summer evening. They open or they play 3 Kenny Loggins songs in a row midway through the first set to give us the first Loggins trio. But then they start playing a song called A Western Sun, which is this interesting song that, lyrically top 5 Goose song for me from a just symbolic standpoint, from what they're covering from a subject matter standpoint. It really kind of focuses on this kind of adventure and this journey, and it focuses on relationships between fathers and sons, and it goes off into this jam, and it ends up being about a 30-minute long jam that fuses really minimalist, kind of dimly lit guitar-led jamming with Peter just like banging away at the keyboards. It moves into the much derided, understandably so, but it works here, 4 on the floor jamming, where Ben sounds as though he's playing a techno beat. Works for a short period in time before moving into very naturally a melodic, almost hood-like jam. Apologies for the blasphemy, but it does. I don't know how else to describe it.
And call me a blasphemer because I wrote something very similar in my notes.
Yeah,
There we go.
nailed it.
And it showcases the band's ability to take you on a journey. And for all the praise I'm about to heap on this band, the one thing I will say is I don't think that they've played a better jam since this point in time, and I keep waiting for the next jam like this. It feels like a huge breakthrough, and it feels in a way like a jam that the band is still riding a high off of, where they found a formula that really worked in those 30 minutes, and they keep going back to it in a lot of cases, even though stylistically they've changed since that point in time. It's, to me, still the most compelling jam that they've ever played. And it segues into a song Echo of the Rose, which at the time was quite slow, has now become a much faster indie pop type of song. But that then in itself goes into a 23-minute long jam, and it ends the set with essentially 50 minutes of music. So this was another one of those moments where the internet kind of blew up. The listeners, were attracted to this band specifically because of this version. And for someone like myself, it just has always felt like a next step forward for the band as they continued evolving.
Yeah, listening back to this, I'd heard this once before, but not in a long time. And I was just blown away by this almost hour long of music. And I've listened to it twice this last week. The lyrics of both of these songs are absolutely incredible. A Western Sun is just pure poetry. Their use of imagery and metaphor and simile, it's so effective. There's like a narrative arc of the story about, like Brian was saying, this wisdom being passed down from someone who's gone, and understanding that Rick has lost his father. It's a really moving kind of context to understand a lot of Rick's songwriting. It also has that really catchy, like lyrical hook that's so powerful. This like go everywhere, feel everything, see everyone you want. It's got that moment that when you're hearing it live and you feel those words, it sounds like a mantra in a way that is super powerful. Listening to this jam, everything you said, Brian, I totally agree with. It has such a monster sound. It's so layered, and the percussion is just like, it's just bringing it. It drops into this like super fast and hypnotic groove. And then, like you were saying, Brian, there's these variations that Rick is playing on top of it. So he's kind of like bubbling along on top of the rhythm section, playing different versions of that same kind of like bass line. And the rhythm section is just keeping everything just moving in this way that is super driving. And the fact that it then has this like perfect sultry segue into this slow reggae style Echo of a Rose is so satisfying at the end of that kind of a peak, the end of that kind of a jam. And then this echo also builds to a super great peak. It sounds really exploratory, really curious sounding. Ben is just doing incredible fills throughout the whole thing. It's really dreaming and floaty, super beautiful. And then at the end, there are these like tremendous peaks, and you can just hear Peter yelling or someone yelling, like, yeah. And I love that. Like, it's like when you hear Trey back in the early 90s, like when you hear them yelling like that, you know that they understand that they're creating something super amazing. And if you've never heard this, this is a must listen.
For me, it's when Fishman screams during a 97 Isabella. When he goes, yeah. And it's like, all right, they're in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
My impressions first, and I'm listening to this outside of context of their evolution. It's really helping me understand why this song and this segue, I guess, is what it is. Because when this first started on my first listen, I thought, oh, it's a like rhythm guitar giddy up with solid lead vocals. It reminded me a little bit of Railroad Earth in terms of style. And I really enjoy that. That's one of my favorites. And when Rick started singing, I wrote, this is what keeps me thinking that there's a reason to take Goose seriously. And the lyrics, as you broke down, Megan, like the generational themes and aspects and the different figurative language that he uses, as an English teacher, I'm going to eat that up. But it's meaningful too. It's better songwriting than most of what's out there, in my opinion. And then I wrote at about 5.5 minutes, the song ends sort of, because this is when the jam begins. And this is the recurring theme I talked about at the beginning of our chat. I don't know. It just seemed like it kept ending and picking up again. I wrote it ends again, but there's still 21 minutes left. I like that part where there's a slow, kind of aimless jamming. I wrote it's kind of like 1973 playing in the band. Where it would just kind of peter out. And it's fun for me as a listener, for my ear to track each band member for a few seconds and jump around. This is at about 11.5 minutes. And it develops into a dual guitar lick. And it's polished. And I know there's kind of like connotations to that word, depending on which side you're on. Polished in the jam band world could be bad. Polished, if you're just looking for solid music, can be wonderful. For me, it's like perfectly straddling that line. I just wanted to hear more. So I don't know. I couldn't tell. This is one of those parts where I couldn't tell if it was composed or spontaneous. And that seemed to be a developing theme. I was turned off a little bit by the jam at about 20 minutes. It didn't sound that compelling to me because I've heard tons of bands do something like that before. But I loved love the very ending of it at about 23 minutes when it gets to kind of like a stereotypical, I put in quotes, Western film progression. You know, it relates to itself. It's meta. It relates to its title. And I thought that was a nice, cute nod. I like that.
Agree.
Yeah. And pretty smooth transition back to the rockabilly before into Echo of a Rose, which starts with a slow reggae beat. And again, I described the jam as a non sequitur because it was confusing to me. Like, why bother writing these great songs if you're going to stick a predictable vamp in the middle of it? But those are my first reactions because I've softened as I listened to this playlist for about 10 days now, over and over again. Now it's expected because I know what to expect.
There's always this desire to make like a direct comparison between Goose and Phish, and I'm guilty of it myself. But you compared the like kind of meandering part to like a 73 playing in the band, and I think that's a really apt comparison. I think it's also like it opens up a discussion around part of the challenge I think Goose has right now is that Phish is still playing so well. And we're going to get to this as we talk about the fall tour, because Phish, by the time Goose ends their summer tour, Phish goes on tour and nobody knows what to expect. And Phish ends up playing this incredible summer 2021 tour. And then everyone at the end of it is like, well, they can't play a better tour than that. And then you get the JFAT shows when, you know, COVID takes Trey's band all out and we just get jams for 4 or 5 nights. And then you get this stunning fall 2021 tour. And this was a competition, if you will, that Phish didn't have to deal with. By the time Phish was rising, the Grateful Dead weren't playing as many meaningful shows.
Yep.
Someone out there is going to take offense to that. I understand they were all meaningful. I get it. But like,
no,
I've listened to 94, 95 Dead, and there's a lot of challenges in there. It's not like the Dead was burning everything to the ground the way Phish still is at times.
Someone taking issue to a Grateful Dead opinion on a podcast? Nah, never happened.
I was there. I can
someone under
attest.
40. No, but my point in all this is like, we're so inclined to compare aspects of Goose's jamming directly to Phish, and the reality is they're influenced by Phish, but more from a show production standpoint, more from a structural standpoint, less from a overtly we want our music to sound like them. And I think kind of jumping ahead to the end of the summer, you know, one of the other things that Goose did that was almost brilliant, but also probably pissed off a lot of Goose curious or Goose non-curious folks who just kept hearing about Goose, was Goose threw a music festival. And they threw a music festival on the grounds of Lock-In, and they invited other bands to support them in their festival. Now, for someone like myself, I loved this. I thought it was incredibly bold. I also felt like it was probably 2 years too early. The festival has not necessarily aged in the way that other great moments have, because overall the music wasn't as strong as some of the rest of the summer tour and especially the fall tour. But this kind of brings us to the next jam that we had on the list, which was the August 22nd, 2021 Tumble. The reason I selected this was Tumble is my favorite Goose song. Every time they play a Tumble is a win. It's a great thing. And, you know, regardless of what the version is like, I've seen it at pretty much every run I've gone to. And every time I see it, I'm just blown away by the lyrics and then blown away eventually by the jam. This is, I would consider this to be the strongest version of Tumble that they've played to date. And it does what we heard in minutes like 11 through 18 of the Western Sun it gets into a full-on hypnotic groove where they find a riff and they just distort it and toy with it and play with it for almost 10 minutes. And it shows this band's ability to immediately lock in on an earworm groove and an earworm riff, which is really hard to do in the moment on stage. It's something that, I don't think Trey searches for an earworm riff all the time, but when they lock in on one, that they've locked in on one. It's something that Goose can do almost automatic. And you talk about the polishedness, you talk about the fact that some of these jams do sound rehearsed. Side note to all of this, take this information for what it's worth, Brian. They do notate on set list. They write out their set list before each show. They do notate typically where they're going to jam. Now, sometimes that changes when they go on stage. Some certain songs get cast aside. Certain songs become a jam versus others. But I think that there is an element to them that works with some advanced planning, whereas the magic with Phish happens with Phish just going on stage. And this is like a both sides thing, because Phish goes on stage and sometimes will play the best show you've ever heard or the best jam you've ever heard, and it was not planned. Phish can also go on stage, not have an idea about what they're going to play, and it ends up throwing the entire show off because there's no flow to it. So there's this yin and yang to that. But with Goose, a jam like this, Tumble, really showcases a band that is being intentional about where they want to take a jam.
Yeah, to your point, my head might have been a little bit up my ass when I was talking about that, because first of all, I think I forgot that a band going on without a set list or without a plan is the exception, not the rule. And to have that be an expectation of any band at all, let alone an up and coming younger band, is really unfair of me as a listener to have them coming up. It's like, oh, they plan their jams. Well, yeah, I plan my lesson plans. I'd be a really shitty teacher if I showed up and didn't know what to teach and had to have the kids understand what a simile is by the end of 40 minutes. Like, that would be terrible. So I'm getting some insight and some helpful insight to become a better listener in this sense. I just want to also say that Tumble is the song that hooked in my head more so than anything else on this playlist. I know you mentioned it's your favorite song. It really is a sweet song. This is just a couple days after that video made the rounds on social media of Rick playing it for a bunch of kindergartners. And it's wonderful because it has a message that's very simple, very simplistic, that can relate to myself at 40 years old, or these kids at 6.5. It's universal. It's enjoyable. And man, does that chorus get stuck in your head.
Maybe there's no bad luck. You gotta go down if you wanna get up. It'll all come around one day. But for now, what to do? If you take a tumble, if you take a spill, there is a lesson to learn and a cup to refill. And if you stumble, if you balance, you lose. The road lies ahead, so tie up your shoes. Well, if you stumble, if you take a spill, there is a lesson to learn and a cup to refill. Well, if you stumble, if you balance, you lose. The road lies ahead, so tie up your shoes.
I recommend everyone listen to it, even if you're a Goose shitter. You might like this song despite you might like the song despite yourself. There's room for that. Some of my notes, I thought that this is a very sweet song, first of all. After the song is over, I like this time signature change. That reminded me, forgive me for doing a second Grateful Dead comparison, but it kind of reminded me of Slipknot, where these two guitars are kind of playing in a rhythm or a riff that's kind of at odds with the rhythm that the rhythm section is playing, yet it all comes back together when each part is finished. I really enjoy that. And then it settles into a straightforward groove that kind of has noodling, dueling guitars. And then it speeds up like crazy. It's mostly vamping. There's not a lot of direction to it. Like you were saying, Brian, where there's play for several minutes without changing anything. I heard that in this jam a lot. And I was driving home today. I have about a 40-minute commute. This was the track I put on, and I was able to not pay attention to it like I do with some of my favorite, insert jam band here, where I just realized, 20 minutes have gone by. And because it just keeps me going without paying too much attention. And while I never felt any urgency or compelling, like gripping music during the jam, I would like to note that the first time I listened to this, I stayed up an extra 6 minutes to finish this track. I wasn't ready to just say no and say I heard everything.
You couldn't miss it.
I couldn't miss it.
You couldn't miss it.
That was for those of you who listen to episode 1. Megan has a great memory. My number one issue with Goose was when I saw them live, there's nothing that I felt I couldn't miss. If I went to the bathroom, I just went. Wanted to get a drink, I'm not going to miss anything. But yet, I stayed for the last 6 minutes of this jam. I couldn't miss it.
Love it.
Yeah,
Love it.
We got
That's
you. Yeah. The best thing to me about this jam is just how dancey it is. It reminds me of the place that Phish sometimes finds in No Man's Land jam, where it's like this, there's just this certain dance move that I do when I hear that. And I only do it when there's this certain groove. And like you said, Brian, when Phish finds it in that No Man's jam, it's just like, it's like the sweetest spot. And yeah, Goose is so good at finding that. And this Tumble is a perfect example of it. And what I also wrote down is that Trevor is just laying it down. I think that when you listen to this playlist, there's so many moments that I hear him coming through in a way that is just super compelling. He's incredible.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode.
Looking ahead, I think we can take fall and winter as kind of one chunk because, for me, this is where, and I've said this a couple of times, but this is kind of where the Goose experience goes to the next level as a listener. I mentioned this a couple minutes ago. all of this is kind of happening at a point when Phish comes back. And I remember when Phish came back for the pandemic, after the pandemic, thinking, I don't care if they play a good show ever again. I'm just going to be happy to see these four guys on stage.
Mhm.
And within two shows, they blew all those expectations out the window and were like, okay, this is actually the level that we're coming back at. You have to deal with this. And now we're playing all can't miss shows. And if you just go through that summer tour, the Alpharetta Run, Nashville, Night 2, Deer Creek, Atlantic City, Hershey, Night 2, the Shoreline shows, Dick's. I mean, there's just so much one after another that really elevates what people's expectations were of Phish. And I remember having a conversation with a close friend around this point in time, because basically from end of July through end of October, Phish or Trey was playing some of the most boundary pushing, fascinating music I've literally ever heard out of any of them. And I
Yes.
remember having a conversation with a friend about Goose is really fun. Phish is very serious. And ultimately, I need very serious music. And, there's probably someone out there who's, a Goose fan who's like, I was a believer the whole time, because it's important to note that when Goose goes on tour shortly after Phish concludes their tour, from November 2021 through March 2022, they play arguably to this point in time their strongest segment of music that they've ever played. And these shows cross the country essentially twice and showcase the band at a personal high in terms of realizing success, selling out all of these venues, selling out markets that they were playing in bars before the pandemic. Musical success. At this point in time, they're sitting on a bunch of songs that have already been written that are not being played on stage until the winter tour. But also from a jamming standpoint, taking risks that they were not willing to take or potentially not capable of taking a year to 18 months earlier. And so the jam that we have picked for the fall tour, it's a very, very hard tour to pick a jam. I could have picked a dozen jams for this tour, and I'm still kicking myself that I didn't pick the November 6th Rosewood Heart or the November 22nd Arcadia, but I did pick the November 17th 2021 version of Into the Myst. Part of the reason we picked this was from a diversity standpoint. Meg was, you had a really good note as we were building this playlist that it's really important that we show Brian all the different sides of Goose. And one of the sides of Goose is a fascination with kind of rave culture, with dance, tronica, electronic music. And Into the Myst is built on this looping riff that really builds in a really danceable way. It's a very groovy song. It's similar to the song Creatures in the fact that it's eerie. It sounds like something that could be remixed and could be played in a club. But then this version has this back end solo that goes into this beautiful melodic zone. And that's something that they were tapping into, kind of heart aching type of music that they were tapping into at their best points throughout 2021 and early 2022. So from a fall tour standpoint, that's good. That's a very shining example of what they were doing among many other examples of the tour.
Well, you did a
this
good
jam
job.
is unbelievable. Yeah, I think that the way that they creep into this jam after the lyrics, it's so sexy. It's super patient. They are in no rush. Like, this is the journey, Brian, that you're talking about wanting. I feel like you can hear them listening to each other and going there slowly. And then it just builds into this huge wall of sound. And at the end, when Rick comes in and sings the kind of like chorus or whatever back at the end, it is just a truly epic moment. It's 17 minutes and 40 seconds, and there's not like a second wasted in this jam.
Mm-hmm.
This is stunning. I love this jam.
If your goal collectively was to kind of show me different sides of the band, then yeah, this track does it. They start with the instance beginning again, the rave culture, like you mentioned a little earlier. And my first thought was I did like that they're kind of vacillating between major and minor keys, basically every other bar. When I find music interesting to listen to, not just fun, but also, oh, wait, let me go back and re-listen to that one again. Kind of like when a track is over, you want to start it again right away. I like the musical complexity here. And I also like that the bass is doing a lot of work harmonically. This is the first time of, what are we up to, maybe 4 songs at this point? I haven't been counting, but this is the first time that, what's his name? Trevor is the bass player?
Trevor, yeah.
Yeah, that he really stood out to me, as I know that a bass player contributes all the time, but that he was really kind of standing above the music in a sense, or at least guiding it or helping. The song slows way down at about 7 minutes, and there's like a rhythm bed, and the guitars, I thought it sounded like the Birds to me. Then we go for another speed up with guitar fireworks, and then this is what I heard about on, toxic social media about Phish and Goose, with the war, that there's finally, oh my God, the long awaited and much derived auto tune. And I was like, this doesn't bother me at all. It just kind of blends in. Like, who gives a shit? And this is like the biggest thing that a lot of hardcore and old jaded vet Phish fans, that's like their first opening shot against Goose. Oh, they use auto tune. This is nothing, and not in a bad way. I mean, it's just part of the song.
Well, it's a stylistic choice.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a throwback to the 80s. It's that Peter Gabriel, like old 80s synth auto-tune sound. I mean, it's cool.
But it's kind of like
It's
a little
retro.
kid. It's a little kid who's scared of going to the doctor to get a flu shot, and then he gets the shot. It's like, oh, that didn't hurt. Like that, because I hadn't heard this before. And from all the talk and sparring about, oh my God, they use auto tune, they suck. They're weak. They're artificial, and it's, wow, you're making a big deal over nothing.
Yeah, no, I'm on the same page with both of you. I mean, for me, one of my favorite albums of the last decade and one of my favorite albums of all time was the self-titled Bon Iver record. And that record is filled with auto-tune. And I remember listening to it in 2011. And to your point, Meg, like it felt like it cracked a code for me in terms of, oh, I actually think I do like 80s pop. I really like this music. And it sent me down rabbit holes, and that record in a lot of cases like preceded a lot of the music that I'm fascinated by today. And when I heard Goose do it, I was like, okay, that's these guys are, I think, 10-ish years younger than me. When they were coming up and they were hearing the indie rock music of the late 2000s, whereas I was hearing it in my mid 20s, they were hearing it in their mid teens. That is foundational music for someone as they're hearing it at that point in time. That's when someone's putting their first record collection together. So that music does not sound outdated to them. It does not sound like music that you would, scoff at. It sounds like music. And it doesn't surprise me that that's an influence that they would take. And it's always been something that I've admired out of them, because it showcases a studio prowess in a live setting. Transitioning just to the winter 2022 tour, the biggest thing that this builds off of from the fall tour, the biggest differentiating factor is they take these really substantial jams that you heard throughout the fall tour and they just blow them out. Like every show, you have this one show in Nashville that has 5 20-minute songs in the second set. And it's just it's every single big Goose song played one after another, all in 20-minute versions. You have San Francisco, the second night, has a version of Wisteria Lane that is, fans will get down on the altar and like praise this Wisteria Lane, because it showcases a development that happens in 2022 where Peter starts to leave the keyboard rig a bit more, embrace his second guitar, and him and Rick are now taking those melodic riffs that they're distorting, that they're playing in a hypnotic type of way, and it's now the two of them playing together rather than just one guitar and piano kind of setting the backdrop. And so you hear this band start to experiment even further and figure out, okay, Peter is actually originally a guitarist. He learned how to play keyboards. Let's let him play his absolute best sometimes during these jams. As I noted, the fall tour was really hard to figure out a jam. The spring tour was even harder. There are so many jams I left on the cutting room floor while trying to build this playlist out that gave you both song introductions, important song introductions, but also really good jam introductions. But before I get to that, the one thing I will say is, for anyone out there who is like, I've heard Goose, I haven't heard that next level Goose, I want to hear what next level Goose sounds like, my recommendation would be, if you're familiar with the band and you want to dive into full shows that just show this like consistent progression, March 9th, 2022 through March 12th, 2022. They're showing just outside of Detroit. They're showing Cleveland, and there are 2 shows in Philadelphia, specifically the last night, March 12th, which personally I consider the best Goose show that's been played to date. Those 4 shows really, really showcase, in the same way that like a really good Phish run showcases a completely locked in band. Those
like the
4
Island
shows
Tour, for example.
Similar in that sort of sense. It shows just a band that is completely locked in. Every song selection is the right song selection. Every jam is the right jam. Aside from the Ghostbusters rap that appears late in 311, but we'll leave that off this podcast. But the jams, the jams, no. That should be good. It is a point of deep sadness for me that continues to pop up. The 3 jams I selected though are the January 29th, 2022 Empress of Organos, which is, Empress is one of their classic Goose songs. It the first time I heard it, I was like, oh, of course Goose has a game henge too. They do not, but this is the first song to give you a sense of like, they have something like theatrical and mystical beyond this, because there's a huge story behind this song, but this really showcases the power of Trevor, the power of silence within the band. The February 7th, 2022, This Old Sea, good friend of mine, we were at a Goose show in November 2021 and they started playing This Old Sea, and he turned to me and said, kids this young shouldn't be able to write a song this good. And it's just, it's one of those songs lyrically that just like, it'll crush your heart. And then this goes off into a jam and does something that Goose does that I wish Phish would do more, which is jam ballads. And that is something huge that Goose does. And then finally, the March 10th Rockdale from Cleveland, Ohio. Rockdale is basically their tribute to the band, and it sounds like as Americana Goose as you can get. And it also usually evolves and develops into either a really high peaking 12 to 14 minute set one closer, or in this case, a 25-minute beautiful melodic adventure that once it comes back to the theme of the song, you're just on a complete high. These three kind of gave diversity, gave us introductions to some of the best Goose songs, and also just kind of showcased where the band was at on such a high level during that tour.
Yeah, and I think winter 2022 was a huge for them. I mean, this whole year they played over 85 shows this year, and Rick has said that this year was such a huge year of growth for them, and that there's so much kind of outside stimulation and pressure. And what's incredible about the band is that I think they really met all these challenges and brought their A game to every single opportunity that was presented this year. And that's why they're continuing to grow as a band.
These three songs were when the 20 plus minute runtime, before I even pressed play on them, started to intimidate me a little bit. This is where it got another 23-minute song that's going to start with thought-provoking lyrics, slow down, and then speed up again. It kind of got a little repetitive at this point. But that said, there's always good things to pick out, even from a hardened cynic like myself. So the Empress of Organos, only good things at this point. I thought this is a fun, simple, solid funk beat. The drums got me first before anything else on this song. There's lots of joy and no drama here. There's a big percussion segment on the bongos. I love the unbridled joy that I can feel through this playing. Like my notes, it's very simple. It says, "This is party music." That was it. That's all it took for me. But then again, it kind of switches. Trevor comes back with a Birdland kind of bass-led riff, not literally Birdland, but it kind of echoes that to me. And then it changes. It slows down again to kind of thought-provoking music. And I'm glad that I was hearing Trevor shine. I'm a sucker for bass-led music, but I was really enjoying those first few minutes. So I kind of conflicted. I'm like, I wish he did more of this and less, not necessarily less of that, but maybe somewhere else. They're picking up, I thought, around 7 minutes with more 4 on the floor beat. They're kind of picking up where Particle left off, for those of you who were around in the early 2000s. So that's maybe a deep cut, but that's what it brought me back to. And then, moving up a key for the guitar to keep following this awesome line that ends it. I enjoyed especially the beginning of the Empress of Organos, but I think I lost my patience a little bit after that bass-led kind of what I called the Birdland part. But that's just my preference as a listener. This Old Sea, what you mentioned, Brian, your friend said that musicians or people that young shouldn't be able to write lyrics like that. I wrote "Working Man's Dead?" ? Like it, yeah. And that's like the highest praise, in my opinion, that a songwriter can get. But I would be lying if I ignored that comment. That's where it took me as a listener. And I consider those on Working Man's Dead some of the greatest songs, American songs at least, ever written. Like I wrote the vocal harmonies, the lyrics are spot on. I will take your every trouble down to the bottom of this old sea. It's almost like getting rid of the trouble isn't that great, because this old sea to me has a connotation of like, it's seen every trouble. And now you're just adding to it. And it really inspired some thoughts in me. I loved this song, although I thought when it should be ending, it's noodling into a jam now. and this is where those common tropes that I started to develop in the negative side of my opinion started coming up again. That it sounded like finally the drummer steps up a little to match the fast pace of the guitar playing by around 9 minutes 40 seconds. It sounds like they're actually jamming and not just vamping. And this is where I exhaled. And I could say, oh, after Tumble, I could listen to this song again too, because it hits all these different emotional spots for me. But this is the first song, I think, of the ones we've discussed today, This Old Sea, that kind of hit me everywhere. And I loved it.
Yeah, this song is so moving. I mean, this is So Many Roads or A Broke Down Palace.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, This is a sweeping story. It's gorgeous and it's timeless. And these lyrics are going to age like fine wine. I mean, it does not get better than this. It really doesn't.
Long we wander the road, turning stones, hoping life may find us still. A drunk on vibes found outside. We've been fooled. Oh, my child, worry no further. Lay your burden on me.
I think this jam is incredible. Rick's playing reminds me even of Jerry a little bit in his solo right after the lyrics. Super delicate. And then the way that it builds just feels inevitable. I think they're really good at building up to a peak that doesn't sound forced. It sounds really like they gently go up to somewhere. And I think that's because they can lock into melody so well. But then Rick blasts through and just absolutely destroys. And Peter puts these incredible layers underneath. And this is an absolutely tremendous version of the song. And I'm glad it won you over. I would actually be concerned if it didn't, because it's pretty magical.
How old are these guys? I would guess early 30s.
They're like early to mid 30s.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not that should matter, but I'm just curious.
Well, it makes it more impressive to write lyrics like this that are, that's kind of like an end of life lyrics. Like those are lyrics that you kind of come to after you've experienced a lot of things.
Like you mentioned the end of the Grateful Dead's career, when like Robert Hunter was writing things like Black Muddy River.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are the lyrics of a man who's lived a life,
Yeah. And that's Rick. He can tap into a depth that not many people at all can tap into. And I think that that's what's so interesting about him. And if you put that next to The Empress, which when I first started to hear this song, I didn't love it. There's just so many kind of like tempo changes. And it reminded me of a Phish song, which sounds weird to say when I say I don't like it, but I was like, this sounds like Phish in a way, how it's just kind of like bouncing all over different places.
It's a little schizophrenic.
Yeah, but then it just won me over because that when you hear it live, it has that celebratory hands in the air. Oh, what a day to be living. That's just a magical moment when you're like in the room and you're feeling that. It's hard to be cynical in that moment, and you just have to it just wins you over. And I think that it often leads to some really great jams too. So it's one of those cool songs that there's a lot of Phish songs like that that are weird, but then end up in these incredible jams. And Rockdale, this song, when the first time I heard this song, I will never forget it because I thought it was a cover. I was like, this is obviously a cover song because it sounds like it's always existed. It's just so classic. It's the kind of song you want to hear in a bar and you're like, oh, fuck yes, I love this song, and you want to like cheer somebody next to you and like sing it really loud and hug them. It's unbelievably satisfying. True rock and roll moments. Rick is incredible at bringing this song home. Every jam I've ever heard of Rockdale, he brings it back at like the perfect moment. And it feels like rejoicing. It's so great.
Yeah, this is kind of what I was alluding to at the very beginning of this episode, where I was bringing up that Goose to me sounds like as if Phish didn't eschew the possibility of being a little more mainstream. This is the kind of song I think that could do it for Goose. It's an awesome rock riff. It starts the song. I could, exactly like you said, Megan, I could see a lot of people just getting really excited to hear this. I thought this is what I want more of, genuine rock music. And then it goes into experimental music, of course. This is where I'm really in the thick of my more 25 minutes. Like I couldn't listen to all this in one session. I needed to take a break and then revisit Goose. But this jam, I thought was pretty good. Like it switches gears. It goes all over the place. The percussionist comes through, wind chimes everywhere on this track, by the way, which you don't hear that often. And I don't know, there's xylophones. I just wrote, yes, sir, lead the way on the xylophones. It's just that, the only other band that I've found that really successfully uses xylophones in a jam or in improvisational segment is Mo. And I thought this kind of had that sort of confidence. And I really liked it. I could, to your point earlier, Brian, cut out a good 8 to 10 minutes of it because I wanted to get back to the riff the whole time. Go back to the song.
It's something, it's a good transitional piece because, the thing that's, I think, was so challenging from a sales standpoint for Phish was in some cases, to certain listeners, their songs felt like they were goofy throwaways before the jams. And while I love Phish songs as a Phish fan, and the songs were the original thing that pulled me in, there was always, whenever I would try to introduce someone to Phish, there was always an element of, well, but the songs are just, the lyrics don't mean anything. They're all kind of goofy. And then they jam and the jams are cool. And I think Trey, I think all of them have really spent the last 20 years focused on songwriting, and their songwriting, especially in the last decade, the output has increased and the quality has increased in a lot of cases from a personal songwriting standpoint and in terms of speaking directly from the heart, directly from their minds, rather than having these kind of abstract, kind of goofy lyrics stand in for their feelings. And the appeal, as someone who, I said this in the first episode, listens to a lot of indie rock, a lot of classic rock, a lot of songwriters. Bob Dylan's my favorite musician of all time. I need the songs. And that is something that right from the gate, right from the onset of listening to Goose, you get that. But then you also get these jams. And so having that balance between those two, and I often wonder as we kind of look towards the conclusion of the spring tour, the summer tour that they went on, and the Radio City shows where Trey ultimately sat in with them, I wonder if part of his interest in the band was from a songwriting standpoint. Obviously, he had to see there's a huge phenomenon around this band. There's so much energy here. Their jams are really quality. But as he's looking to, as conversations are starting to happen, looking ahead about a month and a half after the conclusion of the winter tour, they played at the Sweetwater Festival the same day that Trey played. I can't tell you how many people logged into their set simply because there were rumors abound that Trey was going to sit in with them. And then moving into the June run, they played some very quality shows, but it all builds up to Radio City, where they play these 2 shows at Radio City. They've been advertising these shows for 6 months at this point in time. So many people are coming to New York to see them. And then on the 25th, around 1:00 in the afternoon, images start floating around the internet of Trey's rig being loaded into the venue. And this kind of represents the next big moment in Goose history. And for us, the conclusion of this episode, because there's so much to focus on what this did to impact the band. But this is kind of like a cutoff point for Goose, because up until this point in time, they're their own thing. And they're obviously receiving the comparisons, but they have not yet gotten the hat tip from Trey. And to this point, Trey hasn't really sat in with a lot of other young up and coming jam bands. It's just not really been his style, especially of late. Now he is saying, okay, I understand the significance. The band understands the significance. The audience understands the significance. Not only am I going to come out there and sit in with them, but I'm going to sit in for an extended set through some of their best songs being the key word, and showing I can hold my own with Rick in his songs and seeing if we can elevate Rick as a guitarist. And so you have this just like incredible elements of the band, the fan base, all meeting together around one evening in late June, where they take an undeniable step forward. But also for someone like myself, diehard Phish fan, has been listening to Goose at that point for a couple of years. It was one of the happiest and probably my favorite musical moment of all of 2022 was watching Trey play with that band at that point in time.
I'll never forget that moment when Trey hits that Hungersite riff. I mentioned this in the last episode, but my family was really upset that I went to that show because I was supposed to be with them at night. But hearing that live was so incredible because I had just never seen Trey as this elder statesman before. And to see him, this is the beginning of the torch conversation. Like now it seems like it's been around forever, but this is it. This is like when it started. And just knowing that he was making this choice to play their songs and to take what I think is kind of like Hungersite is kind of the song of 2022, and to take that riff and let it ring out through Radio City Music Hall. I watch this video every once in a while because it's just pure joy. You can see Rick is someone who's not super emotive on stage, and he is so happy in that moment. And he's just like, all the band is, they show Ben right before that, and Ben's a huge Phish fan, and he's like just smiling ear to ear. They're all just like, they know what a big deal this is. And the fact that Trey did that is, to me, just showed just this humility and this deference to him, to the band, and an ability to say, like, I'm in this position now to kind of give forward. And to me, as someone who watched Jerry go down and never kind of give the nod to Phish, and I know that he had a lot of things going on and clearly wasn't in a place to be doing that, but it always kind of bothered me that the Grateful Dead wouldn't ever like throw them a bone and be like, yeah, they're fucking great, and they never would, and they never did, and it's fine. But to me, I just always thought it was, I don't know, just kind of cold-hearted. And so to see Trey up there, like healthy, doing that, I just felt so grateful. And it was so great watching them on stage because, he's set to do these 2 songs. And then you can see him after every song go up to Rick and say, like, can I stay? And Rick's like, yeah, stay. Like, stay, do it, man, do it. And then he stays for like this, a long set. It's so incredible. And I agree that moment is hard to overestimate what that meant to me as a Phish fan, to see, and as someone who was just getting into Goose, to see that moment happen between those 2 musicians. Yeah, it really elevated Goose in my mind, and it also elevated Trey in my mind.
So as we mentioned in the previous episode, Megan and I were at the first show. Let's not forget that before Trey sat in at Radio City, there was a concert the night before. It was a 2-night run. And I did not go to the second night, the one where Trey sat in, even though I had the opportunity, and I saw the photo of Trey's gear that was very quickly spreading around the internet, which, conspiracy theorist that I am, I do believe was leaked by Goose in a very smart marketing move to sell out Radio City. I applaud them if that's the case, but I have no proof or any sort of backing for that. It is pure speculation.
I thought it was someone on Twitter. It was someone on Twitter.
It was someone on Twitter,
that took
I'm
the
sure.
picture, yeah.
But I'm sure it was, hey, come over here. Anyway, I'll just go watch JFK for the 90th time, Oliver Stone's movie. But
Freaking amazing movie, my God.
I love that movie.
Oh my God.
So
Start
much.
a podcast.
I love that movie.
Yeah, I'm in.
John
Oh my God.
John
2 Brians
Candy.
watch Oliver Stone movies. Let's start it.
Oh.
tomorrow.
Oh my God. Wait, I want to be involved in this. And let me just say, my brother, a guest, messed up. And my brother watched that show when he was like 11 or 12, that movie. And he came in and he was like, I didn't know the world was like this. It just like, it made him realize that like corruption existed. Yeah. Anyway.
And Oliver Stone is rubbing his hands together.
Yeah. Maybe I'll come on your podcast. We'll see if I'm available.
Yeah, we'll see. But anyway, my point being was I don't regret missing that second night, because anyone who listened to episode 1 knew my impression of Goose from that first night. I wasn't impressed. I didn't feel like I was seeing anything compelling, and I didn't see any huge reason to stay. And so when I saw the Trey was coming, I'm like, oh, well, good for them. Good for them. But what you just said, Megan, about Trey kind of being this elder statesman currently, it reminded me way back in 1999 when Phil Lesh invited Trey and Paige on In the Warfield to play with Phil and friends after his liver transplant. Phil's liver transplant, that is, not Trey or Paige's. He was the Phish was already selling out arenas, of course, but in terms of that insular hierarchy of the jam band world, Trey and Paige were the kids. They were guesting with Phil. Now the tables have turned, right? Trey is the one who kind of grants legitimacy to other groups. You know, even Fare Thee Well was kind of this in-between equality where he was on stage with whatever you want to call them, the other ones or further, whatever, the Grateful Dead. But it's kind of like showing this ascent of Trey as an individual, as a musician, and I can't get that word out of my head, as a statesman. So I am very excited to look forward to see what happens in our next episode when we talk about the Taboos tour, because I have a feeling, without listening to too much of it yet or understanding the context of it, except in the big picture, that it kind of exploded that hint that showed at the second night of Radio City. We have a lot to look forward to.
We do, yeah. We have Goose releasing Dripfield, the conclusion of their summer tour, which came with some huge venues that they would play at for the first time. A really successful fall tour that also showcased them playing a ton of festivals that had just further elevated their status. Obviously, the Taboos tour, the Goose Myst, and then this most recent spring 2023 run. So lots to dive into, lots of music that I hope everyone out there has enjoyed here in this episode. This has been a ton of fun. Thank you for getting us all together here, Brian, to do this.
Well, Brian, thanks for taking the time. Megan, thank you. And I can't wait for episode 3. Right after we sign off here, I'm sure we're going to start scheduling it for everyone out there. So if you haven't yet, check the show notes for this playlist that we've been just going on and on about, because it's worth listening to. And that comes from any, a jaded vet Phish fan that's as skeptical as any of you out there. It's at least worth listening to through at least once. If you like it or not, at least you're an informed jaded vet now. So thank you again for listening. Megan, Brian, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
And that's it for today's episode of Flocking Outside. I'd like to thank Brian and Megan yet again for being my tutors, my Sherpas, my guides to Goose. It was such a pleasure discussing the music, and I'm looking forward to next week where we talk about the future, what the future might hold for this band. A lot, a little, who knows? But thank you so much for listening. If you haven't yet, check out episode 1, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you again for episode 3. See you next week on Flocking Outside or Attendance Bias, whichever way you want it. Take care.